All right, so it looks like we've had time for folks to get entered into here and have their computers populate. So we'll go ahead and get started. And so we're going to start off with some introductory remarks, and then we'll get going with the conversation. All right, so hello, everyone. Welcome to today's panel discussion. My name is Abe Flanagan, and I'm the Senior Chair of the Studying and Self-Regulated Learning SIG for the American Educational Research Association. The other members of our SIG's leadership team include Divya Varir, Anna Brady, Lauren Cabrera, Michelle Taub, Kendall Hartley, Ying Wong, and Charles Raphael. On behalf of our SIG's executive committee, I'd just like to express our heartfelt gratitude to each one of you for coming to today's event. We know that folks are incredibly busy this time of year, and we appreciate you taking the time to be here with us. The title of today's discussion is Obstacles to Effective Self-Regulated Learning, Research and Remedies. And throughout this conversation, we're going to discuss a variety of factors that can impede effective self-regulation, and we'll also identify and discuss what researchers and practitioners can do to remedy those issues. It's my honor and privilege to introduce our incredible panel of 5 renowned scholars. Today's panelists include Doctors Roger Azevedo, Nikki Lobczowski, David Miele, Teomara Rutherford, and Kui Xie. So now we're going to give all of our panelists a few moments to introduce themselves to everybody in attendance today. And so we'll just go alphabetical order by last name. So Roger, we'll get started with you first.
All right. Thank you so much, Abe. Hello, everyone. Glad to be here. Thank you, Abe, for the invitation. Looking forward to this panel. Roger Azevedo. I'm a full professor at the University of Central Florida in the School of Modeling, Simulation, and Training. I'm also the lead scientist for the Learning Science Cluster and the co-lead for the cluster, and obviously study self-regulation, multimodal channel data across advanced learning technologies. Thank you.
Thank you, Roger. And so now we'll go with Nikki.
I hate that I have to follow Roger. I'm Nikki Lobczowski. I'm an assistant professor in the learning sciences at McGill University up in Canada, in Montreal. My research focuses on social regulation of learning and designing adaptive technologies to support learning. Excited to be here.
Thanks so much. Okay. David?
Hi, thanks, Abe. It's great to be here. My name is David Miele. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Counseling, Developmental, and Educational Psychology at Boston College, where I'm also the director of the Applied Psych PhD program and head the Motivation, Metacognition, and Learning Laboratory, with my focus of my research primarily being the role of motivation in self-regulated learning.
Teomara?
Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. I'm Teomara Rutherford, Associate Professor of Learning Sciences at University of Delaware, and my research focuses on learning and motivation in online and other technology environments, especially in math and computer science.
Thanks so much. And then Kui?
Hello, my name is Kui Xie. I'm a professor of educational psychology and educational technology at the Michigan State University. I'm also the department chair for the Department of Counseling at Psych and Special Education. I'm rather new to my role. Recently, I moved from the Ohio State to Michigan State, so I am glad to see many Ohio State folks here, as well as Michigan State folks here.
Thank you so much, everybody. And if everybody could just join me in giving them all of our panelists a little round of applause here as a thanks for joining us today. I know we've got a great group. All right, and so before we get started with the conversation, I'm going to give you a little overview of today's proceedings so that everybody knows kind of what's in store and how things will shake out today. So our panelists were provided with a list of 5 questions beforehand that we're going to use to guide today's conversation. And the panelists will go through and respond to each of those questions, one at a time. So question we pose, group discussion on that one, and then move on to the next. If time allows, we've also prepared some individual questions for each panelist based on their scholarship and expertise. And then we'll commit the last 15 or 20 minutes or so of today's conversation for question and answer. And then finally, today's conversation is going to focus on self-regulated learning. Shouldn't be a surprise, we're the self-regulated learning SIG. And I want to make sure that everybody in attendance is on the same page about what that actually means. The flyer for this event went out to multiple organizations. And so I just want to make sure that we all have a shared understanding about what self-regulated learning or self-regulation of learning refers to. So we're going to borrow from Shunk and Green 2018. They provided a pretty clear definition of self-regulated learning as the ways that learners systematically activate and sustain their cognitions, motivations, behaviors, and affects towards the attainment of their learning goals. And then in 2001, Zimmerman also added that self-regulation of learning involves behaviorally, cognitively, metacognitively, and motivationally being active in one's learning and performance. So when we talk about self-regulation of learning or self-regulated learning, that's the kind of definition that we can all have in mind. So without further delay, I'll stop talking because you're not here to hear me talk, you're here to hear them talk, and we'll get the party started. So the first question that we have actually extends the conversation that we had in our panel discussion back in November. The title of that panel discussion was Applying Self-Regulated Learning Theory and Research to Communities of Color, Current Shortcomings, and How to Address. And during that conversation, we shed light on some ways that research has shortchanged students of color and limited our collective understanding of their self-regulation of learning experiences. So in the spirit of keeping that important discussion going, let's talk about what our panelists today, what their research programs have uncovered regarding the self-regulated learning experiences of students from underserved or understudied communities. What are the unique barriers to self-regulated learning that students from these communities face? And how might we as educators or researchers help these students overcome those unique barriers? And Dr. Rutherford, we'll start with you.
Thanks. This is a huge question and a big important area of focus. And so I want to highlight what was discussed in the last panel discussion, a little bit about how many of our schools are designed to uphold whiteness and colonial ideals. So students of color often have to engage in more regulation to address threats or to work toward their own goals that might be in addition to or in conflict to these kinds of colonial ideals. So for some examples of the work that I've been involved in, the work of my postdoc, Dr. Haven Lee, she shows that community college students who were home during the COVID-19 closures had to regulate their external environment, like finding a quiet place to work, in ways that their more privileged peers might not have have to have done. And, towards supporting those students, she has other work that shows that hearing about the challenges and successes, and she's used social media videos recorded by near peer mentors, can improve the students' grades and persistence in their STEM major she's focusing on in particular. And so some of my work as an advisor for EF plus math is focusing on finding the ways to understand and support the brilliance of Black and Latinx students in executive functions, which is related to SRL. And we've learned, and this goes back to some of the things that were talked about last panel, that we need new measures and new conceptualizations of EF and math brilliance. And then also to really embed our work in the communities that we want to serve and hear what's working and not working for them. And so in the last panel, there's also a lot of discussion on understanding students as humans and their lives outside the classroom. And our own work on motivation surveys kind of aligns with that. The students say like they really want their teachers to know about them as people. And this is especially important when we're talking about communities of color, because teachers bring their own backgrounds and biases, and this can influence who they give opportunities to regulate to and how they provide those opportunities. And in our work, we've seen quite a bit of variance in how much autonomy, for example, students are given in the classroom. That's just a few examples from my own work, but obviously we really need to do more to interrogate our methods, to de-emphasize these individual responsibility narratives and find ways to examine the context and the external forces on students.
I'll add something similar but different is something I've been really looking into lately is these kind of the impact of culture on SRL. So similar, different, cultural, broadly defined, and how, what effective SRL even looks like in different cultures. So one of the things I've been thinking about a lot is like help seeking and things look different, for different students are sometimes encouraged not to ask questions or to challenge different perspectives and things like that. And so, I think even going back to exactly what Taya said, but even taking a step further of saying what I think there's a colonialism and there's a whiteness embedded in how we're currently defining what effective SRL even means, and what that looks like and how we measure it in a bunch of other things.
I think one area that's maybe relevant to this is I recently have done a systematic review on phenomena called online racial discrimination, really looking at how the social space, the technology space has created discrimination against people of color. So our finding really shows quite interesting. Racial discrimination started, with technology that was limited, like chat rooms or publishing type of work, until the Web 2.0 concept really served a place. Like now, we're at a social network space that really amplified the channel for those discriminatory behaviors to spread quite quickly. So what we find is, students or youth in this age have to navigate those discriminations either personally or vicariously. And then, especially for underrepresented group, they would have to pay extra attention and then to really navigate this type of phenomena. This is important because the social spaces has penetrated to our everyday life, so it's unavoidable. We are living in those spaces that poses barriers for students of color who has to really navigate those discrimination.
I'll chime in with a couple kind of more speculative points. But just to, I think often, in these kinds of discussions, in the context of self-regulated learning, we're very focused on, what's going on inside the student and the student's psychology and how they're interpreting aspects of context. But I think equally important is to kind of get in the heads of, the caregivers who are structuring the environments in which the children and students are self-regulating, and so we've done some recent work, or we're currently doing some work on the mindsets of teachers and how teachers with less growth mindsets show some evidence of kind of differential treatment of elementary school students based on their perceptions of the student's ability level. And one of the ways that we've wanted to extend that is to look whether that these mindset beliefs kind of interact with the stereotypes that they hold about individuals from different groups. Because if they're if they're treating students differently depending on their perceptions of their ability level in math, let's say, and they believe that students who look a certain way are less likely to have a certain amount of ability, then they might be less autonomy supportive or more controlling, because they just don't expect as much from them, even if those kinds of assumptions are held more implicitly and not apparent to them themselves. So that's one example of some ways in which we could begin to look at the psychology of the caregivers. Could be setting students up to kind of bridge certain gaps or exacerbate them.
I guess to add a little bit to what's already been said. So thinking about our central region of Florida, where we have lots of underrepresented minorities. And also, so a lot of our new research has focused on underrepresented minorities, specifically Hispanic students, and UCF is an HSI. So there's a lot of focus in that area. And also women in STEM. So we've been working with teachers to really understand what these issues are, and then how can we better design technologies to both enhance teacher education, whether it's through dashboards, but also thinking about, like they was saying, in terms of thinking about new measures. So, we have a tradition of collecting multimodal, multi-channel data, but thinking about technologies, something that Kui said, how can we use technologies, not just to teach self-regulation, right? Which has already traditionally been done, but thinking about other aspects such as, can we use technologies to be able to detect and actually to model what these self-regulatory processes are and to support the students? And what does that support look like, whether it's using pedagogical agents or intelligent virtual humans, or other peers that are, pedagogical agents, so unconversational agents. And I think we can get a lot of mileage if we start exploring the use of generative AI to be able to do that, especially through natural language processing, where I can actually express myself, who I am as a self-regulatory being, using NLP, be able to understand that. And now I can have, almost a quasi-natural interaction with a pedagogical agent that could be a peer, teacher, student, expert, etc.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody, for raising such interesting points. And while I was listening through everybody's responses, I wasn't able to get all of them jotted down, but I was just trying to jot down, what are some actionable steps that we could do to help, students from underserved, understudied communities, more effectively self-regulate their learning. And so I heard things about providing mindset and implicit bias training for classroom teachers. It sounds like taking more of a whole student approach to understanding and working with our students. So at the beginning, Taya had mentioned that students from those communities kind of have to self-regulate in more ways than students from the dominant communities might. So I was thinking something about like emotional regulation, so especially like Kui said about technology and kind of the burden that it can place on students and facing more discrimination. That's going to place a huge burden on your ability to regulate your emotions. And so I think those are two things that stood out to me. And then also Roger's comments at the end about, how can we go forward to use AI in ways that'll also support those students. So I think that those are three kind of actionable steps that came up in the conversation. Were there any other actionable steps that folks think would be pertinent to repeat?
I think, oh, sorry.
I'll just add quickly. I think anytime you're talking about designing for specific communities, you need to incorporate designing with those specific communities. And I think they're often left out, and we can read all we want and we can make our assumptions, but until we bring in those students and those, and those communities to understand what exactly it is they need, we're just going to be continuing to have these conversations until we do that. Sorry, Taya.
Excellent point. Thank you.
Yeah. No, I would like to emphasize Nikki's point is extremely important. So in a lot of the work that we do, whether it's games or simulations or even holographic simulations, these communities, we use a basically co-participatory design, right? Where they're not just the recipients of the technology we design and develop and implement, but they are actually the active participants in designing the technology.
I think something that I heard in a number of our answers was to move towards conceptualizations of SRL that look at like fixing students and instead really focus on the environment and the socializers around them.
Awesome. Thank you so much, everybody. So now we'll move on to the next question, developmental factors and self-regulated learning. All right, so we're going to talk about, what are the obstacles to effective self-regulated learning that are pertinent to age and developmental factors. For instance, consider self-regulation of learning for elementary versus middle grades versus secondary education versus college education. What have you all found or observed regarding the interplay among age, development, and self-regulation of learning? All right, and then based on what you've observed or found, what can educators do? And David, we'll start with you.
All right, thanks, Abe. think one developmental trend that's pretty well established in school children at this point is, and one that has clear implications for their self-regulated learning, is a steady decrease in their expectancies for success and task values from early elementary school, all the way through to high school and perhaps beyond. And this could be a product of a number of factors, including the increasing ability of children to form more accurate assessments of their ability in different domains, such that they go from being somewhat overconfident when they're quite young to being more realistic in their self-perceptions. But it also could be due to the increasing level of challenge and material in certain domains, such as mathematics, as they progress through the school system. It could be partly how the schools themselves and the classrooms are structured. But regardless of the reasons, right, this poses a problem for educators because it makes it more likely that students will disengage from certain topics or subject matters as they progress through the school system. Now, one way that some educators might try to address this problem is to water down the material that they present to students, particularly students who might feel apprehensive or sensitive to negative feedback. The problem with this is that although it might serve to protect or safeguard their motivation in that domain, it might also prevent them from being exposed to important material that will help them to develop core competencies. So another possibility, which I've been exploring with my colleagues, Bridget Finn, who's I think in the audience, and who's really the originator and driving force behind this research, as well as Alan Wakefield, is to see if we can, maintain the original level of challenge, but to structure the task in such a way that it's perceived as less aversive. So how can we do this? Well, the judgment and decision-making literature has actually documented some interesting biases that we can take advantage of. And in particular, researchers in this field, such as Danny Kahneman, have shown that our retrospective memories of prior events and tasks are not really representative of how much pleasure or pain we experienced overall throughout an activity. Instead, we tend to weight certain parts of an experience, such as the ending, more heavily when judging past experiences. Indeed, when we translated this phenomena over to a learning context, we found that adults prefer a challenging math task that has some easier problems added to the beginning or end of the activity to a shorter task that only includes the challenging material. And we can tell this is really a bias in memory because on average, not only do they prefer the longer task, they actually perceive it to be shorter, right? So in one version of the task, they might be asked to do, 30 challenging math problems with 10 more moderate problems at the beginning or the end. In the other task that they're asked to do is just 30 equally challenging math problems. So overall, the longer task has just as many challenging and kind of aversive problems, but it takes longer to complete because you're also doing these additional set of math problems, yet they prefer that longer task and think it's shorter. So our next question was, does this effect emerge in students as well? And how early do we see it emerge? And so we conducted a series of studies across multiple school districts in New Jersey with both elementary and secondary school students. And the findings from the first study actually just coincidentally came out in Journal of Ed Psych yesterday, I believe, online. And what we found is that children in both 3rd and 6th grade preferred a task that included a set of challenging, but age-appropriate math problems, along with a smaller set of easier math problems at the beginning or end of the task, to a different task that included only the smaller set of just challenging items. They also found overall, on average, perceived the longer task to be shorter. They expected to do better on tasks like the longer task. They valued it more. They perceived it to have fewer costs. Interestingly, when it came to looking at the position of where optimally you want to place the easier items at the beginning or end, or even in the middle, what we found in general is that people, even adults, and there was some evidence that for the children too, they tended to there was less of a motivational impact when you just had it in the middle. And like adults, the 3rd and 6th graders were showing kind of effects when they included them at the beginning or the end, but the 6th graders tended to show stronger effects when the items were included at the beginning. And the third graders showed stronger effects when it was included at the end. And it just seemed to be mostly driven by, although I think we'd really need to follow it up, the third graders not showing particularly strong effects when the easier items were placed at the beginning. And so speculatively, right, we could potentially attribute this to developmental differences in the memory of third graders versus sixth graders, because past research has shown that primacy effects for memory in younger children are weaker than slightly older children. So in general, what we're finding is that one potential way to kind of bolster or at least maintain the motivation of even relatively young students in a difficult domain like math is to not to kind of water down the material, but to actually kind of play with the structure of the task in a way that enhances their perception of it. And so, we're looking forward to trying to actually develop, an intervention that would see if this plays out over the course of an entire semester and so forth.
That sounds like such an interesting and promising strategy for, increasing motivation, self-efficacy beliefs of students, that if you can leverage that strategy early on in a difficult domain like math ed, that, we'd be able to, it seems to have really, really powerful impacts on student motivation from the get-go. Do you have a, you mentioned that this study was recently published in Journal of Ed Psych. Do you happen to have like a citation that you might be able to throw into the chat?
Yeah, I will. Maybe Bridget, you could throw it in, but it's Finn, Miele, and Wigfield, 2024. It's only online right now. It hasn't been published in a volume yet.
Mm-hmm.
And I just say the main caveat at this point is, right, we've only really shown these effects regarding, at a kind of task level, and what I think we need to do to show that this is actually generalizable and has real impacts for like curriculum design is to extend it over the course of an entire semester and see that if you repeatedly expose children to, these kind of what we call these remembered success experiences, right, where we just add these slightly easier problems to a number of different tasks throughout a long period of time, does it have some kind of cumulative effect where in overall, like their motivation towards math and not just towards a specific math assignment is enhanced.
And yep, I'll throw that in the chat.
Thanks, Bridget.
Yeah, fascinating stuff. Do any of our other panelists have information? Lessons?
Yeah, I'll have some. It's more of considerations of, as far as going back to the teachers and exactly what David was talking about is like, we have all these findings and we know that there's a big gap, right, between practice and research. And I think a lot of us are really working on that. But I think there's another gap that we often don't realize between research in ed psych and research in like teacher education. And so a lot of the times I see of like, how can teachers do this? You'll see like teachers need more professional development. And I was like, teachers don't need anything else, first of all. And so one of the things I'm realizing is that, and I was a teacher and this was true for me, of that many current teacher ed programs don't focus on SRL. They're really focused on teaching math or teaching certain development and becoming those experts in development. And I have a class where one of my students, we were talking about SRL, and she's a teacher, raised her hand, and like the look of betrayal on her face when she's like, how have I never heard of SRL before? Like we were keeping it from her. And so I think that there's an issue of like collaborating and really, as we're teaching math, learning how to teach math using these kind of skills and talking about the motivation pieces, and not doing more professional development, but better professional development that involves, all these skills.
I should also say that kind of emphasizes the importance of having a general course on learning, an educational psychology course in undergraduate curriculum, which is something that we can be fighting for it, or different institutions.
Well, and I'll say that most of them do have that. I had one, but it wasn't specific to, like, I learned how to do that, but not how to do that in math. And I think that kind of goes back to some, what David was suggesting is like, this kind of looks different in different things, or maybe not, David, I don't want to put words in your mouth. But, thinking about what does it mean in this specific context? And why are, so it's just kind of kept separate. So I've had years and tons of these, here's how you teach math and here's how you do this, but it's so focused on content and not like learning processes. Again, and let me be perfectly clear. I'm not blaming anyone. I think a big part of it is because these fields are kept disjoint when we should be working together a bit more.
I think I agree with Nikki about the importance of learning about development, generally integrated into theory, integrated into subjects, and also in thinking about SRL, thinking about something like executive function and how that develops across the life course, and how, supports for SRL might look different, in early elementary, later elementary, and we have EF developing all the way through mid-20s in many cases. And so knowing that, I think, could be helpful also for teachers and for even folks in higher ed too.
So thinking about to build on that, so thinking about the research that we do, I mean, we focus mostly on middle school, high school, college students, and then part of the developmental obstacles are also another set of developmental, but thinking about the novice expert paradigm in terms of clinicians, right? Medical students, residents, clinicians of all types, and including teachers, pre-service and service teachers. So I think one thing that's interesting is that, we can detect, okay, those processes that we've been talking about, whether they're cognitive, affective, metacognitive, motivational processes, even social processes. And I think what we have an advantage of is using technology. If we can detect that you do not have those skills, or you're not using them optimally or efficaciously, et cetera, is then using technology to actually model those processes, and perhaps we can accelerate the development of SRL skills, right? So for example, we can show your eye tracking data, right, as you're reading about viruses, for example, and we can show you, instead of somebody just telling you, well, the reason you don't understand it is because you didn't pay attention, you didn't read properly. Well, now we can actually show your gaze behavior, right, or attention allocation in terms of heat map, is using the data visualizations or the multimodal data of the students themselves to have them confront, if you will, and mediate that understanding, like show me my data, explain to me, right? And then perhaps even explain how a teacher would do it, a more able peer would do it, et cetera. So I think there's ways of accelerating SRL skill development once we detect what the issues are, specifically focus on multimodal, multi-channel data, and turning those back to students. So we've been doing that with cognition, metacognition, and one of the areas right now is emotion regulation, in terms of clinical issues and clinical reasoning with medical students, residents, and attending physicians.
My research area doesn't really address developmental factors, but I have been reflecting on what I'm listening is also related to the first topic is, to develop our kids' self-regulation skills from young age all the way to adult. There's a lot of support that we need to provide, but there is also a inequity exists in different types of families. Some well-resourced family, they just have the resource and attention and time to support their kids, versus our under-resourced family may not. So, our kids' self-regulation development might be not equitable. So that needs to be considered in education system when we design instructions. How do we attend to those issues? Have we been thinking about addressing those inequities caused just by the fact there is differences among those students, among those faculty, families? So that is a question I was I've been thinking about. I don't have that answer, but that would be maybe some of you guys can address, or maybe future research can address.
I'm seeing a couple of comments in the chat box about implications for higher education, like student affairs, student support, and post-secondary faculty. Are there any of our panelists who have, has any of your research looked at these considerations in higher education? All right, cool. Well, then we will move on to the next question, where we're going to be talking about social and emotional factors and their interplay with self-regulated learning. All right. So, in what ways can social and emotional factors nourish and impede effective self-regulated learning for students? Dr. Lobczowski, we'll start with you.
I think, so thank you for including this question. I'm very excited to talk about this because I feel like sometimes we don't. I like the way it's phrased in that it's about nourishing and impeding, and to really think about the pros and the cons of social environments. And again, I would also argue that all learning is social, but that's a different topic for a different day. Because I think the more work we do with social environments, it causes us to need to consider other elements of the environment when thinking about the targets of SRL. So, I feel like most of the research on SRL that I've seen so far really focuses on the task understanding, the cognitive elements, seeking help and those kind of things. But what we have to consider is in social environments, again, I loosely define that, but about regulating the social interactions, the non-task interactions, helping regulate others, the implications that has for like cognitive load, for development of how prepared students and able students are to do these. So, for example, one of the things I've noticed in a lot of the literature I've seen is that when we go to code these interactions in classrooms, sometimes people will only code like on-task discussions, and they won't code the off-task because their specific questions are focused on their understanding and their cognitive elements, which makes sense, except for there's all this stuff happening in the off-task that influences like understanding, and you can think about like social contagion and co-construction. And so that's one of the big things I found with my dissertation when we observed students in kind of a unstructured, unsupervised group meeting, how they, of course, would get off task. But during those times is where they really started to bond, or the opposite. And in that becomes this idea of trust. And trust is really important when you're, source justification and these kind of things of, do I believe what you say, or should I challenge you, and those kind of things. And so when we only focus on certain cognitive pieces or the specific task pieces, we're missing developing those understandings of the cognitive pieces, but also the implications that they have for SRL. I know that days I can work in my office and no one talks to me. I feel like at the end of the day, I'm like feeling pretty good about everything I got done. But if I talk to a lot of people at the end of the day, I'd like tell my husband just to get away from me. Like I don't want to, I'm so tired, because it just involves so much more to engage in those kind of things. And we need to consider that when we're like, why are they not regulating, or why are they not reflecting at the end, but also the importance of socialization for learning. It's really hard from looking at a developmental perspective for adults sometimes to say, this is what you should do, versus, a peer that can help and talk to them in a way that makes more sense to them. So that idea of co-regulation, of helping others, and I think Taya talked about peer tutoring, and again, similar idea, but even with the like social pieces and the emotional pieces. And then I'll add, to me, one of the biggest areas that I've seen for like consistent interventions related to SRL would be in the SEL, socio-emotional learning literature. I think most of the elementary school teachers I talk to have some sort of program at their school to help students, and most of it's kind of based in the CASEL literature, and it involves students regulating themselves, decision making, regulating others, and there's 5, and of course I don't remember them all right now. But these interventions, you usually see there's something at the elementary schools, and I think that to me is one of the most consistent things I've seen across education for SRL type interventions. But again, one of my biggest issues with them is that they typically are not domain specific, and what my anxiety looks like in math and what my anxiety looks like in reading are different, and the strategies I'm going to use are different. So so that's something. And then again, this goes back to what we were talking about, and I think Taya, you were talking of, like, I feel like most SEL interventions kind of stop in elementary school. They're like, okay, they know it, like a Piagetian of like, now they're fine once they reach adolescence. And any of us that's ever met a teenager knows that's not probably always the case. So just thinking about how do we, these social and emotional skills, like how do we teach students to collaborate? How do we teach students to work with others? Because we most of the time just expect them to know how to do that. And so, looking at these interventions and thinking about whose responsibility is it to kind of teach these? Should it be every teacher? Should it be like a counselor who's more familiar? I could talk, I'll stop there. I'll talk all day.
I want to highlight, Nikki, something you said about trust, and you were mentioning it, I think, in the context of conversations that peers may be having in the class about ideas and defending propositions and things like that. But trust extends well beyond that. If we think about regulation and a student being willing to admit when they're struggling, being willing to seek help, being willing to, even engage in monitoring, and they have to feel that trust and support there.
Exactly. And then again, it also goes back to the teachers. We talk about goal orientation. If you create a competitive classroom, I might be less likely to engage in help seeking behaviors, right? Or if I don't trust somebody, my monitoring changes. So we've talked about emotions and academic emotions, but there's also these social emotions that are really important to consider, and pride and shame and things that are influenced not only by the outcome, but by the social perceptions of who I am in this space.
I just want to build on that. I think that Nikki gave a great response. And I think one of the things it highlights is the need for us as researchers of self-regulated learning to extend and expand our paradigms beyond how students regulate towards a single goal or within a single context. And, so I and more anecdotally, like I teach a course on motivation, emotion, and self-regulated learning for students. And one of the things that I ask them to do is to set a really, pick a really challenging goal that they've set for themselves that semester, and then kind of keep like a project journal weekly about their progress, where as they then connect back to concepts that they're learning about in class to kind of make sense of what their struggles are and what, what's working and what's not working. And, one of the things that I've noticed, and it's true for these older students, but I'm assuming it's true for younger students as well, is like how much the challenges that they're experiencing in other aspects of their life bleed into, the goal that they're pursuing for the purposes of the project. And I think there's been a shift, at least in the motivation space, towards beginning to do work on kind of multiple goal pursuit. And look, I think I saw Yin Kim in the audience, and she's done some great work in this space. And I think there needs to be more of that, looking at how people's pursuit of different goals can sometimes result in conflicts that, can then spill over into other aspects of their life at a kind of affective and motivational level.
I agree. I was literally typing in her information. I don't want to embarrass her, but check it. Like this work is really, really cool of looking at how, we focus on one goal, but really there's so many, and kind of going back to what I was saying, the more goals there are, the regulation, the ability to regulate 1,000 things at once has to go down, right? So how can we focus on one and those kind of things? Thank you, David.
I wanted to share some of my experience on social emotional factors of learning. It's became a very trending topic, at least in the state of Ohio. So especially in K-12 schools. So I started to work with schools to look into their practice on social emotional learning or social emotional factors of learning. What I surprisingly find is there is very little evidence-based teaching practice in the schools. That means there is not and routinely established assessments in the schools or effective ways to use those assessment data on social emotional factors of learning. So there are some tools that they typically use, for example, Panorama, that do assess many aspects of social emotional learning. And then what I find the schools are vary from one another. Some schools are well-resourced, they have the capacity to buy those assessment services. Some don't. I went to a school, I asked for their data, they actually said, wait a second. And then about 15 minutes later, they brought 2 boxes of paper to my desk. It says, that's my data. So it's very different from schools. So we need to attend, there are differences in school, but what I'm trying to stress is also there's a clear lack of evidence-based teaching practice in schools, particularly on social emotional factors of learning. And then there's more evidence-based practice on cognitive side, because the schools are used to do knowledge assessment, science learning assessment, literacy assessment, and then they design interventions or they design learning progressions towards those assessments, based on those assessments, but not on the social emotional factors of learning. So what I tried in Ohio is really try to establish those assessments in those schools and helping them to understand students' social emotional factors of learning. And then the schools can then design some strategies to, kind of fix or support students' social emotional learning.
Kui, I think that is an excellent point in that, too, if you look at the way that schools are set up for assessments, it's those end of course tests, those, the SATs, like, teachers are like judged based on those, right? So what incentive do teachers have for helping create students who are with positive social skills and are emotionally regulated? And because it is extra work. And again, I keep thinking a lot about this of how do we embed these things within the existing teacher education program and the existing curriculum, so it's not just one more thing. And then how do we, again, creating a culture around this, right? Because one teacher can't just pick this up and then they go to another classroom and then they just get fed a different message. So how do we create a culture, a systemic change and focus on this? And the pandemic, I think, has helped in some ways. Sorry, that's the only good thing I'll say about it. But in some ways, of just kind of like a lot of us realize, like, hey, maybe I do need to prioritize my mental health a little bit more. So I'm hoping that'll help. But I think this is a huge issue.
So this has been a pretty lively discussion here on this question. just to kind of try to tie everything all back together, are there, like, if we could list out, like, what are some actionable steps that the teachers could take in order to, promote social emotional growth education in their classrooms and improve students' self-regulation of learning? So, like, what are some actionable steps that we could draw from the conversation here?
I think I'll kind of add in there. I think one of the cool things about emotion is that because of the physiological responses, the monitoring kind of happens without you necessarily wanting to do it. And so I think one of the things that I always try to encourage is not just that you're angry, but what are you angry at? Like really helping them understand where the emotion comes from to kind of get at the root of the problem. Because sometimes we're like, we say emotion regulate, and going back to Gross's model of like, take deep breaths versus like, why don't we address the actual issue? And so I think it's about having like, when we intervene to help students regulate their emotions, I think it's important to show them a variety of strategies, but also have them really think about where is this emotion coming from and how can we address the root of the emotion?
I'll just, add one point to that because I think it's a really important point, this idea that we sometimes just think overall, like, let's just throw strategies at students, teach them anything that they could potentially use without teaching them, like, what strategy would be most effective in what particular context or, given a particular motivational or emotional obstacle that they're dealing with. And there's, the initial work that came out of the emotion regulation literature, following the Gross model was kind of like, reappraisal. It's just, it always is effective, and then more nuanced work came out that said, yeah, in many circumstances it's effective, but in some circumstances, it might actually preclude you from, taking actionable steps to like actually change your environment in ways that might reduce the need to regulate your emotion. And so, in our work on motivation, we very much take this idea of trying to understand whether motivational flexibility is a desirable skill that can also be taught. And I think it's in line with a lot of work coming out of the emotion literature these days as well.
I think one way to address what Nikki and David just said, I mean, this is where obviously learning technologies are wonderful because you can have an immersive virtual environment where you can test out and develop cognitive flexibility, right? Or emotion regulation adaptivity, for example, by trying different aspects of a simulation, right? Whether it's an immersive environment or simulation, so you can change the context and can see how you would react, right? And actually and be able to reflect on how well you did, if you are understanding the emotion, whether it's the goals, etc.
Roger, just to keep going from there. So the panelists are going to be the only ones know that I'm doing this. But let's skip to question 5 here. So you've mentioned a couple of times about the role of technology and intelligent tutoring systems. And so there's been a lot of discussion, anxiety, and optimism surrounding the rise of things like ChatGPT and other applications of artificial intelligence. And as I mentioned, you've already touched on a few times about how these platforms and technologies could be used for good. And so what do we know about how artificial intelligence, like those intelligent tutoring systems, can be leveraged to help students better self-regulate their learning process?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So I think in terms of, if we look at the landscape of learning technologies within many different fields, right? At a higher level, I mean, I think we can use learning technology in many different ways. We can use technologies to induce these self-regulatory processes, right? Because if we can detect that students are not using them, then we can potentially, with AI, if we're able to detect them, right, with a certain level of confidence, is that we can induce those processes in students. We can definitely be using them to detect those processes. Am I actually a good emotion regulator? Well, what does that look like? What is the trace data? Is that facial expression data? Is that physiological data, right? Is that how reactivity in terms of, let's say, if I'm interacting with a non-player character or learning technology? They're great in terms of assessment, right? Going back to our first question, right? In terms of we can actually capture, measure, right? And if we can do that, then can we model these processes over time? What we're doing a lot is we're still in this phase of basically describing by collecting this data, but when are we going to get to the point where I have measured these processes, I've been able to track these processes, and I think we have a bigger issue, which is related to the supporting and fostering these processes, right? Even though all the multimodal data. So let's say the worst possible scenario, right? A student who's got low emotional regulation or no strategies, a very small repertoire of cognitive strategies, is really a poor metacognitive calibrator, right, etc. Even if we can detect that within a particular technology, the question becomes, where are our instructional models in terms of what do we do for that student? How long do I have to sample that data, right? And if I can have sample that data and make those inferences about these processes, how are we to intervene? Our instructional models don't really tell us how to intervene, when to intervene, how to intervene, and then do we know if we're effective in intervening, right? I think the other big cluster of issues is, can we use these technologies to help students reflect? Because we're so worried about inducing these, tracking these, right? But do we ever have students reflect on their own self-regulatory processes? And what does that look like? What do we do to help them reflect? Because everybody talks about reflection, right? And the psychologist's first question I ask is, well, what's your operational definition of reflection? And what's your evidence? What does that look like, right? The other thing I think that would be interesting with AI, thinking especially with generative AI and explainable AI, is can we get agents, allow me as the learner to be able to use language like I'm doing now and using NLP to actually express, you know what, you're getting me to use this, do this task in this particular simulation, and I don't even know what to do. Can I express that in as naturally as I can? And can we have the AI understand that, oh, maybe the issue is you do not know how to create a plan, or let me set some sub goals for you, right? So we have this interaction that goes to becoming a very social, if you will, right? The other thing is, and going back to our last question, is in terms of simulation. I'm in a modeling simulation school, right? So the question is, give me a simulation environment where if you know everything about me as a self-regulatory being, okay, I want you to put me in different instructional, for example, situations and show me how I would solve that problem or read that text or collaborate with that agent, etc. And then based on that, that could be used as a way to teach me how to become a better self-regulator, right? And the other one is just straight up teaching. I mean, we're still not doing any kind of teaching of self-regulatory skills. There's very little data, right? Our teaching paradigms and training paradigms are based on one size fits all, right? But if you're going to train me to be a better self-regulator and you're going to make me, let's say, go through 5 examples or 10 examples, if I've already shown mastery of, let's say, metacognitive monitoring, why are you going to, after 2 cases, why are you going to punish me by having me go through the next 8? Can we make training or teaching of SRL also more adaptive? So those are just some of the issues that we're dealing with, or potentials.
Rogers, are there concerns or other considerations that need to be made for, are there accessibility issues with these technologies? So these programs, they cost money, and the school districts that don't have that money, it's like, what are the concerns in that regard? And do you know what's being done to help remedy those concerns, those problems?
Yeah, those are real problems. I mean, we try to build relationships with several counties, for example, more recently in Florida. So they're open to a certain extent. Some of them are very open. Unfortunately, we have better success with private schools, for example, right? But those are really not the kids. Let's just be honest. These are not the kids who need to be trained or learn about self-regulation because they know how to do that and they got all the resources. Right. So yes, absolutely. Funding is a big issue. The other issue is, us being seen as intruding on instructional time. So we're always very sensitive, right? It's like, oh, we want to do some SRL teaching and training. Well, that could take at least a week. Can we have a week? No, you can't have a week. You can have a day. There's not much we can do in a day. So one of the things that we could do as a community is there are many, many different types of technologies, right, that exist, not just intelligent tutoring systems and games, etc. So the idea is to be able to actually come up with a composite and a clearinghouse, if you will, that already exists of these types of technologies and get a wider community, both nationally and internationally, to use these. And then the other approach is, NSF has now funded, was it 5 national NSF AI institutes. The most recent one is at UIUC. Chad Lane is the PI. So they are developing, I've been on several of these, well, maybe I shouldn't say this, site visit teams. They are doing some really wonderful work. So there's a lot of steps, and also dealing with specific issues, right, of bias, of ethics, of privacy. So yeah, so there are a couple of strategies, but the thing is that we cannot compete with, we can't compete with Ubisoft, we can't compete with EA Sports, right? And so that's also generates another issue, because if you're waiting for that 1.5 million grant from NSF or IES, which is wonderful, right? There's no way you're going to be able to develop something as sophisticated, right, as an industry partner, right? And then you take this to schools, and I mean, I'm sure you've seen this. The kids are like, seriously, you want me to use this? Right. So, talk about motivation and levels of engagement, right, amongst other issues. But there are some solutions.
I'll second Roger. I just want to add on, like, we're so concerned with creating authentic tasks, but then we don't have authentic resources. I look at some of the video games my husband plays and some of the educational technology games, and I'm like, So students are motivated by games doesn't mean that they're going to be motivated by educational games.
Absolutely, Nikki.
I have a question for Roger, just as something that I've been wondering about, because I think the use of technology to kind of scaffold and support self-regulated learning is just, there's so much potential there. But the thing that I struggle with, like when thinking about our own work, right, when we're thinking about, for example, going back to this idea of something like, motivational flexibility, right, knowing that on average in our, in studies in the literature, like certain types of motivation seem to be particularly effective for certain types of tasks, but that's on average. And so, I sometimes worry that, okay, if we were to take that and then, into a computer-based environment where we're making very individualized recommendations, how do we know that it works for that particular student? And how can you, like, what kinds of, where are we at this point where we can, the tools themselves can first do a kind of an assessment of, like, what that person's profile is and what strategies might work uniquely for them versus for the average student?
Yeah, David, that's been one of the biggest struggles that we see, not only in terms of educational technology, but if we think about the field of AI in education that some of us belong to in intelligent tutoring systems, right? It's almost like we've been kind of tackling the cognition, the affect, the metacognition, and then the motivation. I mean, us included, our team and our collaborators, we're still using self-report measures, right? So mastery oriented, that's great. That's at the beginning, that's a pretest. But, we keep asking, can we not start treating motivation as motivational states that actually fluctuate during learning with the technology or problem solving, right? So, but like you said, one way is to start thinking about them as measurement tools. So for example, can we have, if we look at the work of Judy Kay, University of Sydney, in terms of open learner models, right? Can have a slider where we teach kids, like, here's a slider. So interest, right? Some of the work you do, right? Interest. Task value. So if we had these, can we get the student to indicate during their interaction with the technology? It's like, so, oh, my task value, has increased, or my interest in this particular topic, right? It's half an hour has drastically decreased. So can we start infusing these techniques, methods, or visualizations, or even using non-player characters? It's like, well, it looks like you haven't moved much off this page about viruses. Is it because you're not interested anymore? Can we get the student to articulate, but use these as research tools that could be embedded, right? But there are instructional, but also research tools, right, to get to that. And the question is, for example, even if you detect that I'm mastery oriented, if you give me a task with a certain technology, let's say over 90 minutes or even a day or 2 hours, will it fluctuate, right? And if it does, then all of a sudden become performance oriented. When does that happen? How do we know, right? So yeah.
Now, I think in addition to that, though, is kind of, even if we are able to kind of very accurately identify what motivational state they happen to be in the current moment, like, how are we able to predict what is likely to be the most appropriate motivational state for them, given all the ways in which that particular goal orientation might interact with all the other psychological processes that are combining into some kind of emergent process at that
Absolutely.
time. But, goal orientation literature is a perfect example because it's full of just like, complicated, moderated effects, right? There's no kind of straightforward association, between a performance goal and a particular outcome.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you use the verb that really triggered something, which is, we're still in this phase of our science where we are still describing, we're doing describing and explaining, but when are we going to get to that prediction? And is it predicting like what you're going to do in the next 5 minutes? Like what also goes, is it next hour? Is it a week from now? Thinking about especially things like, processes like motivation and emotions, right? It might take a month to develop self-efficacy to become, good at hypothesizing. But our experiments also don't allow us to capture that, right? Yeah.
I'll add on a similar idea that we've talked about throughout, even going back to our first question about underserved communities and things like this, and this idea that we're trying to build systems that are personalized and adaptable, but how do we make those scalable? So we're talking, and I mean scalable across across different communities, but even across like a curriculum. I've seen so many interventions that will come in exactly what Roger's saying of like, how long will it take to actually change this? Because on the back end, to create one unit, one math unit takes all these people and all these kind of things. And so, can I change their SRL processes within this unit? And then we leave, right? Then we leave and we never see these students again sometimes. And so, but it's because it's so difficult to make these things more sustainable, more integrated, more embedded. And so how do we, and with all the individual differences as well, like exactly with the goal orientation of, can we measure every single one of those things and then adapt it to this unique mixture? Is that what we want? And so and anytime you have to deal with technology, you have to think about feasibility, because now you're also talking about more money, more collaborators, all these different things. And then going back to the other things of like teacher understanding, resources, all the things that impact the use, trust. And so I feel like I'm just bringing up problems, but
Yeah. Yeah, no, but this is interesting. Yeah. So, and we've been, for decades, when we build these technologies, it's like, we're building, for example, think about MetaTutor, right? Develop an intelligent tutoring system to teach about, the human circulatory system that has a very particular model of self-regulation embedded, right? Fill and analysis, but also has included, multimedia learning principles, right? Of Mayer, et cetera. And you really focus on cognition, metacognition. So, we're all, how about we change that instead of focusing on specific topic based on specific theoretical frameworks, and we develop, for example, and this doesn't have to be intelligent tutoring system, it can be any kind of technology, really. I'll just put it out there. But how about we create an environment to teach students about SRL across topics, right?
Yeah, Roger, I could see that being particularly useful for students who are taking, like online courses where they don't directly have a teacher there. So whether it's a college student or if it's K-12 students who are doing some form of online schooling where they don't have the teacher there to directly scaffold their learning processes and teach them and model for them self-regulation of learning. I could see that as being a powerful application of that.
Yeah.
Roger, I believe there are many programs that's already being implemented that specifically to train students self-regulation. I know at Ohio State, I keep mentioning Ohio State because that's where I came from there. But they had a nice center called Dennis Learning Center. I believe they specifically designed courses to train students how to learn. And then they are primarily built upon the self-regulation theory to design their curriculum. They have a series of curriculum that teaches college kids how to self-regulate in the regular classroom, in online environment, how to use technology. So there are training programs out there.
Sure. Oh yeah, quite. I didn't mean that there are none. I mean, I know there's some at UNC Chapel Hill. I mean, everybody's got. I mean, it's almost like every university basically has some kind of whatever you want to call it, right? Teaching skills, etc., and specific to self-regulation. But what I'm thinking is, again, it's kind of a one size fits all. Because imagine you had that embodied in a technology that had AI. Now you're getting individualized training, right, and teaching of SRL skills across potentially different topics that is really adaptive to you, if that makes sense, right? Yeah. So it's almost like thinking about maybe potentially the next generation of AI systems, right? But yeah.
Awesome, great. Thanks so much for the lively conversation there. And I had mentioned online learning environments, and so I think that would help us transition into our last question here for Dr. Xie about the online learning environment is in many ways markedly different from face-to-face classroom. Which self-regulation of learning processes are perhaps most important for student success in online learning environments, and what obstacles to effective self-regulation of learning do these students most commonly face, and what can we do about it?
Yes, thank you. Well, when we talk about online learning space, we need to think about distinctions between using online resources for learning versus learning, participating in distance programs. I assume we are looking at the distance program where students participate learning through media technology mediated channels. So in that sense, students are typically isolated in different physical locations. So the physical isolation will be the major differences here. And then while then relate to self-regulated learning, then there's a lack of structured environment that would typically support students' learning and motivation that would occur in a classroom, like their teachers that set schedules and so forth, right? And then also lack of social support, because then they are physically isolated in their locations. They may not be, their peers may not be that readily accessible. So if you have to communicate, then there is technology there you have to use. But then, so that creates a lot of difference when we talk about students learning in this type of environment. You have to really rely on your self-regulation to navigate the learning experience in online settings. Again, I mean, I don't think the areas of regulation is different. You need to manage your motivation, setting goals, setting tasks, setting time. But it's the context is different. Online students, particularly a student who primarily taking online programs, they're different profiles. They're different group of learners. They may mostly work full-time. They're busy. They have family. They have job. They have to navigate all this in terms and study. So we need to acknowledge we're dealing with different. It's a different group of people that we're studying. And then online learning have also very unique features. Students are attending online learning experiences through the modality that sometimes are synchronous, sometimes are asynchronous, sometimes it's blended, sometimes it's flipped. And then in a case, so we really need to attend to the modality that we're talking about. And then another quite important area that we do wanted to attend is because students may or may not even meet each other in person, they may feel a sense of, real or not real. So we call social presence. So they may not even think this is a real thing. So that's a challenge we have to face to help our students in the online classes to establish that type of social presence. And then other features like content relevance, technology usability, and then interactions, all those areas we need to attend when designing learning, particularly to facilitate self-regulated learning. At the same time, when we design online learning, we need to think about where students' context, the context in which student may learn. So you need to think about people are in different homes. Some homes might be nice. Maybe a kid has their own private office versus the other home may have 5 kids sitting around a dining table participating in learning. So we really need to think about a diverse context that our students are located in. And then that is very important when we think about self-regulated learning. And then social features as well. And then again, we need to project our students, the context our students is in. They may be in a very different social environment. There may be individual students that study alone. They may be studying in groups, and they may be studying in a church. You know, we need to think about all this diverse context so we can design specific instructions to support them. Another part is the technology features that we need to think about because online learning heavily rely on technology. And then this is the field that evolves the most rapidly. So we have just the VR is emerging, the generative AI is emerging. It will quickly change the landscape of what we mean by online learning. Therefore, again, the research in terms of online learning and self-regulation in that area needs to also evolve. Maybe we need to develop newer theories to address, how people learn in online settings because the technology is evolving. The meaning of learning may even be changing. So, the last point I think, Roger, you've already kind of talked about is online learning do offer newer opportunities for us to research because the technology affordances give us the data tracing capacity. We may be able to build more fine-grained models about how students learn. But at the same time, a lot of our research, including myself, is trying to use this log data we call behavioral traces, to model some of the psychological processes. But then, I myself facing the same challenge, but then sometimes I question myself, which is a question maybe to the panel as well. Like when we're trying to use our behavioral trace data to model, for example, students' motivation, and then it's quite complex, quite difficult. But then my other question is then why can't we just simply ask our students to tell us how do they feel? A question, that's it. Rather than a very complex processes algorithm to model that. So I'm starting to implement another way to combine this learning analytics modeling with some sort of self-report, which I call experiential sampling methods. I think there's nothing wrong of asking students a question how they feel, but sometimes in our educational psychology research, we typically do ask those questions out of the context, out of the moment, when students have to recall what they did, what they feel at that moment. So I believe experiential sampling methods may address those challenges by asking students in the moment, in the task, when they are doing things, and how they feel. They may actually be quite relevant or valid, those type of answers. So may actually help us to resolve the dilemma of whether we should just using computing AI to diagnose students' feeling, or can we just ask students how they feel? Those are some of my thoughts. Sorry, it's getting too long.
I'd love to respond, not to the last point, but to something else you said, Kui, about, you gave a lot of the great challenges of regulating in completely online environments. But I think there are some affordances too to the way that the classes are structured, the kind of there's some more organizational systems in play to scaffold student self-regulation. And we have a study interviewing K2 teachers about what they did when they were online. And they did say some of that stuff. For some kids, they were much better at regulating their learning because they had this structure. And then there's a big difference between kind of emergency online instruction during the pandemic and the kind of online learning where you have an instructor who's prepared to teach online. They know what the resources are. There would be examples. For one example, in the classroom, there's a sign up all the time that kind of gives the steps for something. And the teacher didn't know, well, how can I, in an online classroom, replicate that same thing? And we talked about, you could make a separate instance on Zoom that's just a screen share of that sign. All of these different ways that they kind of have to engineer to recreate the in-person classroom versus if they were just designing for an online environment. So when we think about affordances for self-regulation, there are like two very kind of different classes there in preparation for the teachers.
I wanted to build off of, or actually respond to a kind of one of their later points, actually, since Taya, addressed one of your earlier points, which is that I think the point that you made about, how reliable are students' self-reports of certain experiential states, including motivation or emotion. I think it really does depend on how retrospective it is or in the moment. And some of the work I talked about before just shows the kind of retrospective biases we all show in thinking about the affective experiences of that we had during a particular task. But I would say you seem to be kind of juxtaposing. Well, you can have like the AI try to just look at the trace data and make an inference, or you can just ask the student. But why not just treat like some of the in-situ, like in the moment, reports of how they're actually feeling? It's just yet another data point in the pattern, and just treating it like, like what we know emotions are. They are inherently kind of multimodal, right? Emotions are this kind of, emergent state, which is a function of our behavioral tendencies and our feelings, and our arousal, and to the extent to which we can kind of capture all of that and kind of time sync it, then we'll be more likely to kind of make predictions on the entire holistic experience of that motivational state or emotion, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but a lot of that work is already, has been done, right, with multimodal data, adding more data channels. One of the challenges, though, is the context. So, they talked about affordances, right? So affordance of the technology, affordances of where you are, back to Kui's original response, but also is the contextualization, right? How will an AI, if you have a teacher in the classroom, they can actually understand, hopefully, because they've been trained, right, to understand the context. But for example, if I'm expressing this right now, as I'm trying to do, so this is A4, so I can show intensity, right? If you look at the literature, basically this has been generalized as basically confusion. So that means that all AI algorithms, if you see this, that the student is confused. Well, what about the context? It may be confusion for me, but if you're doing math, for example, it can be deep concentration, or it could be just like, I don't know, something popped into my head and so I'm reacting to it. How do we know what we are measuring and observing and making accurate inferences? So in order, David, like you said, to be able to predict, right, or error, right, we capture a lot of error, right?
Yeah.
So especially with physiological senses. So, you'll see like a heightened arousal, but what happens? It's like, oh, maybe I hit the sensor on the table, on the desk, right? And so here we are trying to figure out, oh my gosh, for based on baseline and changes in baseline, it was huge. So is it psychologically, relevant? Do I need to intervene pedagogically? Meanwhile, it was an error in the signal, if you will, right? Or some kind of measurement error.
Well, the thing that seems particularly complicated here is like, what is the standard? What are we using to identify the real state, right? And some people would say, well, you don't want to take the student at their word, and so other, because there's all kinds of potential reflective biases involved. And other people would say, no, that should be the thing that we use to validate, all the other patterns. But that's almost a kind of philosophical choice.
Yeah. But get to the one of the methodological issues of something you just said is that, at the beginning of each experiment, right, before it even began, as part of the kind of the pre-testing session, is we get, each individual student to actually, again, act out these different states, right? So that anything that we capture on you is compared to you, right, and not to someone else or a large, database of, let's say, Caucasian students, adult students, if you will, right?
I think just to kind of connect all the way back to some of the earlier discussion of, trying to make sure that how we're measuring certain kinds of psychological states is representative of the diverse set of experiences that people from different backgrounds might have, and not assuming that because, you know, the average kind of participant in a psychological study who's, you know, white and middle class labels emotions in a certain way, that somebody from a different community wouldn't label the same type of underlying kind of arousal pattern using a completely different term. I mean, to the extent that you would take a kind of more constructionist view of emotions and motivational states, like Lisa Feldman Barrett or somebody like that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And even just, for example, to pick on confusion, it could be that, you know, there's the 6 of us. I mean, I'm seeing 6, right, videos on my screen, right? And let's say we're all working on the same task. And even if we all express confusion, you know, it's not going to, again, you know, it's not going to be one size fits all, because my source of confusion may be different than the rest of you, right? And until we find out what that source is, what was that trigger, right? What was that event? Why, right? How are we going to offer individualized training or intervention potentially to deal with somebody's confusion? If you can detect confusion, that's fine, but then you still don't know what the source of that confusion or that particular state is, right? Yeah. And this is where the AI can engage in a conversation. It's like, oh, I see that you're confused. Can you explain to me why you're confused, right?
Well, I think that the problem eventually will become, you know, even regardless of the source, given a certain recognizable pattern that the AI has identified as confusion per se, or let's use a kind of more easily, a more ambiguous emotion like excitement versus anxiety or apprehension, right? Like the AI might read those almost exactly the same just based on underlying kind of physiological input, right? But one person might, based on past experiences and beliefs about what certain kinds of emotions are or not, say, oh, this is apprehension, and that might lead them to a whole like different kind of chain of inferences and beliefs about what they can do to follow up or respond to that feeling, and the other person categorizes it completely differently. But now imagine the environment where the AI is actually telling you, I see that you're experiencing excitement. And then you say, well, no, I'm experiencing anxiety. No. This is, trust me, I'm the AI. This is excitement. I mean, so those are the kinds of, I think, you know, tricky situations that we're going to have to think carefully about.
Absolutely. You know, and this is where I think, you know, in a classroom or at home or, you know, anywhere where there's a human, right? I mean, for example, a teacher obviously would have a better knowledge and history of each particular student, right? Just because of your daily interaction. Now, imagine that advantage versus an AI where I just jumped on. It has no history, like we were talking about. These are all historical things, you know, the baggage, if you will, right? That we as humans, learners, bring to the situation, right? If it doesn't know that, it's really operating, you know, in a blind up to a certain point, right?
All right, everybody, it feels wrong to try to cut this conversation short. But we're coming up on, we're scheduled until 3:30. It's 3:29 right now. You know, certainly I hope that these conversations keep going when we're off of Zoom as well. So I just want to make sure to take the time while we still got a decent sized audience here to everybody put our physical hands or your electronic hands together and just say thank you to our panelists for such a wonderful discussion today. I know that I learned a lot. I'm sure everybody else did as well. And, you know, going into my weekend, I certainly have a lot of interesting questions floating around in my head that make for a fun weekend to try to unpack those things. And so I'm going to post into the chat. We have a Qualtrics survey that we created. If folks would take a few moments to fill that out, that will give us some good feedback about the programming that we had today, and then plan future programming as well. You know, we certainly want to, you know, build these programming, you know, with the input of our community. So feel free to take a couple of minutes to fill that out. And again, thank you so much, everybody, for our panelists today, for coming today, for sharing your insights, and also for the audience for taking the time to join us today. We really appreciate it, and hope to see everybody in Philadelphia at AERA. Our business meeting is scheduled for Sunday evening. And so if folks are able to make that, then we certainly hope that we'll see everybody there. It was originally scheduled, I believe, for Saturday evening, but there was a conflict with some other organizations, and so we moved away from that conflict. So Sunday evening is our business meeting for AER. All right, so everybody have if you're on the East Coast like me, the weekend is right at your doorstep. If you're further to the West, then you're further away from your weekend, I suppose. So take care. Thank you again for stopping by, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for all your work organizing this, Abe.
Yes,
Thank
thank
you.
you so much.
Thank you. A pleasure.
Yes, thank
Bye,
you.
guys. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.